Thank you, everyone, for this great opportunity to present our research work this conference. So our project is titled Combining Repetitive Transcranial Magnetic Stimulation with Transcranial Direct Current Stimulation and Treating Psychiatric Conditions, a Systematic Review. And so first of all, what is repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, which I'll refer to as RTMS? So it involves a coil that generates and delivers magnetic pulses to the brain at a predetermined quantity, also known as pulse number, frequency, and intensity. And so there are a few different protocols and mechanisms involved. And so RTMS utilizes high frequency protocols such as 10 hertz to increase cortical excitability in regions such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which I'll refer to as a DLPFC. Thereby, it enhances the top-down control of the DLPFC over the amygdala. And as we know, hyperactivity in the amygdala is one of the culprits for many psychiatric conditions. There's also a low frequency RTMS, usually about 1 hertz, and this decreases cortical excitability by enhancing GABAergic activity and reducing glutamatergic output, which then can be used to suppress hyperactive regions or maladaptive connectivity patterns in the brain. So currently the high frequency simulation model is what's most frequently used. Sometimes low frequency is used, sometimes combined is used, and sometimes there's a method referred to as intermittent theta burst. That one is pretty much the same as RTMS, but uses even higher frequencies of 50 hertz. And so there are other mechanisms that RTMS works on. So it also promotes neuroplasticity through N-methyl D-aspartate, NMDA receptor-dependent mechanisms, as well as dopamine signaling at the D1 receptor. So what is transcranial direct current stimulation, also known as TDCS? So TDCS is a variant of transcranial electrical stimulation, and it is an alternative form of a non-invasive brain stimulation that externally deploys a weak direct current, 1 to 2 milliamps of electricity. And the setup involves an anode and a cathode, a battery-powered device, as well as wires, and the current flows from the anode to the cathode. So its mechanism is that it modulates cortical excitability and synaptic plasticity in targeted regions, such as the DLPFC, by shifting neuronal membrane potentials. So the anodal stimulation depolarizes neurons, which increases excitability, while the cathode stimulation hyperpolarizes neurons and decreases excitability. So this allows the restoring of excitatory and inhibitory balance, and this improves, again, functional connectivity within the DLPFC and downstream targets such as the amygdala. So similar principles as the RTMS. And by this method, it can ameliorate core psychiatric symptoms, including depressive mood, cognitive deficits, and anxiety. And so the majority of the studies targeted the right and or left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in both RTMS and TDCS in the studies that we found. And so why even use interventional modalities in psychiatry? So 30.9% of patients with major depressive disorder and 36.9% of those with schizophrenia experience treatment resistance. And we know that non-invasive brain stimulation techniques have shown promise in treating multiple psychiatric disorders, especially and including the case of treatment resistance. And so what's the current literature on these interventional modalities? So RTMS has demonstrated efficacy in treating various mental disorders, including treatment-resistant depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, negative symptoms of schizophrenia, and substance use disorders. And the research has also explored TDCS in the treatment of various psychiatric disorders and has revealed some benefit, again, for treatment-resistant depression and substance use disorders. However, it is not yet approved for psychiatric disorders, FDA approved. So the idea is that combining these NIBS protocols could yield greater symptom improvement with a shorter time of onset and longer duration compared to single therapy approaches. And so to date, there have not been any reviews that have examined the combination of RTMS and TDCS. So therefore, our study aim in this systematic review is to broadly survey and examine all the excellent studies that have assessed the combination of RTMS and TDCS in treating psychiatric disorders and symptoms. And so commonly with systematic reviews, our methods followed the PRISMA guidelines and GBI manual for systematic procedures. We collaborated very closely with a librarian who really helped us develop and finalize our search strategies and decide on which databases we would search. And so the second step is the literature search, and you can see the databases we used there. And then next, we did the study selection. So this involved using the tool known as Covidence, and there were two independent reviewers that looked at the article separately. So the first stage involved independently screening the abstracts and making sure that they met inclusion criteria. So in the abstract, it had to mention that both RTMS and TDCS were used, and they were targeting psychiatric conditions or symptoms. Had to be original research, so no reviews were included in the final results, and had to be available in English. And then after that, we had our full text, which were independently reviewed, and then disagreements were resolved through discussion between the reviewers. And then we got to the data extraction phase, which involved synthesizing the results, including generating tables based on key components and themes of the articles. And so our results, on the right there, you can see the PRISMA flowchart of how many articles we started with. I won't go through all of it for the sake of time, but our initial search yielded near 3,000 articles. And then by the end of the abstract and full text screening, we had 14 articles that were ultimately included in the study. And so 7 of these addressed depressive disorders. There was one RCT reporting on depressive and anxiety symptoms, one experimental study on physiological and psychological stress, 2 case reports on OCD, 1 pilot study on Alzheimer's disease, and 1 RCT and 1 case report on chronic insomnia were found. And so this beautiful visual summary that our co-author created really summarizes our key findings very well, and also highlights which brain regions were targeted in the different studies. So you can see there's a legend there on the left that color codes the different regions. And so the majority of the studies did target the right and or left DLPFC, as I mentioned earlier. And so for depression, we had 2 RCTs and 2 case reports that found reduced depression severity, and 1 RCT and case report that also demonstrated greater remission rates over time using combined therapy. And there was 1 RCT involving females, patients with I'm going to butcher this, D. Department syndrome. And they performed a secondary analysis of depression and anxiety post-treatment. And interestingly, they didn't find changes in depressive symptoms in that group, but they found anxiety symptoms were significantly reduced 4 weeks later. And then for bipolar, there were 2 studies, and interestingly, they only highlighted cognitive improvement. However, it was unclear how long these effects lasted, but there was really mixed results regarding the mania and depression component of the bipolar. And then for OCD, the first case report looked at ultra treatment-resistant OCD. And 1 month following the combined treatment, the study reported a sustained decrease in obsession and compulsions as measured by the Yale-Brown Obsessive-Compulsive Scale. And then there was another case report that also looked at treatment-resistant OCD. And this one was a bit unique from the other studies, is that it didn't provide RTMS and TDCS in the same treatment session, but rather these participants got like 2 weeks of TDCS and then 2 weeks of RTMS treatments to simplify it. So for this group, interestingly, there was only a decrease, there was a decrease in anxiety and depression scales. However, once they got the 2 weeks of RTMS, after that, this change was no longer significant, which was a bit of an odd finding. And then for Alzheimer's, the combined treatments succeeded over TDCS alone in improving neuropsychiatric symptoms. However, the study found this difference was non-significant when you compared it to RTMS monotherapy. Nevertheless, there was superiority of combined regarding improvements in sleep disturbance and sleep quality, and improvements in sleep quality were then significantly associated with improvements in MMSE scores, which is a cognition, like a global cognition test. So then for chronic insomnia, interestingly, there were superior improvements in sleep quantity, efficiency, and daytime functioning with combined treatment. However, remission rates were not significantly different between the groups. Finally, this is not mentioned on the slide, but for schizophrenia, there were no studies specifically that met criteria for our review. However, there was one ongoing RCT, and this RCT aims to measure the response of positive and negative symptoms, cognitive performance, and functional brain activity following combined treatment. And so to summarize our results, mainly, we found depression outcomes. So combined RTMS and TDCS showed greater symptom improvement, response rates, and remission over monotherapy for depression symptoms. And then for other psychiatric conditions, preliminary evidence only showed benefit for chronic insomnia, which I guess arguably we can argue whether or not how much that is a psychiatric condition. But yeah, the research on other mental illnesses such as bipolar, OCD, etc., were limited and inconclusive. And so for the limitations of the study, we had a small number of studies. Protocols were very variable. There were short follow-up periods and insufficient data for meta-analysis. For the treatment protocols, most studies applied TDCS before RTMS, so treatment order effects remain unclear. And then for schizophrenia, which is one of the main disorders often treated in interventional psychiatry, has not been investigated using dual therapy, RTMS and TDCS. The strengths of this review is that it's the first comprehensive review on combined dual therapy, and the study did focus on mostly treatment-resistant patients, which enhances its clinical relevance. In the future, we need more standardized protocols, longer-term follow-up, and exploration of combined therapy across more psychiatric conditions. So to conclude, RTMS and TDCS have been safely combined in treatment of psychiatric disorders and symptoms with a similar safety profile compared to single therapy. While the evidence is generally early in this development, multiple studies suggest greater improvements in depression and chronic insomnia and cognitive function compared to monotherapy. However, further research is needed to optimize protocols and expand its application. These are my references, and that's all. Thanks so much for listening.